Welcome back to Vintage Camera Digest. Today we're heading back 90 years to 1934 to look at the Zeiss-Ikon Super Ikonta. So stick around. In the world of photography, there are very few brands that might give us the same degree of implied quality as that of Zeiss. The Zeiss name has been associated with fine photography and optics for over 100 years, and through the early and mid-20th century, they produced a staggering number of cameras. As a camera company, Zeiss-Ikon began in 1926 with the merger of 4 separate German camera companies, and they were able to capitalize on each of those companies' strengths over the ensuing 50 or so years. As a camera manufacturer, Zeiss-Ikon was extremely prolific. In 1927, for example, their catalog listed 104 different model names with an average of 3 different formats, as well as 3 or more lens shutter combinations per format. So that's over 900 different variations of stock models you could choose from that year alone. And these were the early models, years before the more famous Zeiss-Ikon cameras came about, like the Contax, Contaflex, the Ikontas, and the Super Ikontas. This is a Super Ikonta C 530/2 model, which sports a coupled rangefinder focusing and a native 6x9 format, which means I can get 8 shots from a roll of 120 film. So I'm going to load this, but I'm going to go ahead and close the camera up because it's a lot easier to load when it's compact. You open the back by sliding the button underneath the carrying strap toward the top of the camera. In this camera, film is wound left to right, so the new roll of film is going to go in the left-hand film chamber, and the take-up spool is going to go into the right. Once the film is secured to the take-up spool, close the back and use the wind knob on the bottom right to advance the film until you see the number 1 in the leftmost red window. Now, you'll notice that this camera has a second red window. What's up with that? Well, this model is also capable of shooting 645 format if you have the 645 reduction mask for this camera. I don't have one of those, and they seem to be pretty rare, but in case you're lucky enough to have one of these with the mask, you'll use the following procedure to wind the film. For the first shot, wind the film until the number 1 shows in the window. After you've made that exposure, you wind the film until that same number 1 shows in the second window. Right, and that will put the film in the correct place for the second exposure. That's with the mask now, right? Now, I agree that's a weird way to advance film, but here's the reason that is. Kodak came out with 120 film in 1901 to be used in the number 2 Brownie box camera, and that camera would give 8 6x9 exposures per roll. So the early 120 films only had numbering on the paper for 6x9 format cameras. It wasn't until much later, when 120 came to be used in multiple formats, that the additional numbers were added to the paper backing at the time. So with this camera, you just use the same number twice. It's an incredibly simple solution. Could be confusing, but it is simple. Carrying on, pressing this little chrome button by the rangefinder will open the camera, and the viewfinder will also spring into place. The only thing left to do at that point is to rotate the rangefinder wedge into the proper position. So this particular camera has a 105mm 4.5 Carl Zeiss Tessar with a Compure shutter featuring speeds from 1 to 1/250th of a second, plus B and T. Now, the mark speeds are a little bit different than the standardized speeds we see today, but they're generally close enough to what you'll find on exposure meters that it won't be a huge problem. You cock the shutter with this lever here, and the shutter release is right down here at the bottom. Now, these cameras also featured an additional shutter release, but on this camera, it's missing some of those parts, so I'll just have to stick with the bottom one, or use a cable release by screwing it in right there. Now, on to the focusing. With the rangefinder wedge rotated out and positioned correctly, and looking through the rangefinder window in the back, you just rotate the focusing dial, and you'll see a superimposed circle. You just rotate the dial until those 2 images align, and now you're good to go. So you just use the viewfinder window to compose, and you're ready to make an exposure. After exposure, just wind the film on until the next number appears in the first red window, the one on the left. Folding the camera away is pretty much like any other folder. We're going to collapse the viewfinder windows, rotate the rangefinder wedge back into position, press down on the struts by the bellows, and close it up. All we need to do now is run a couple of rolls of film through it. For this shoot, we're headed back to Berry College in Rome, Georgia, so let's head out. I am back here at Berry College in Rome, Georgia. It's a nice clear day. I was out here in December and shot a lot of black and white, and a couple of you mentioned, wow, that would be a magical place to shoot if you had color film. So today, I've got a roll of color, at least one roll of color. So we're gonna shoot some of these old buildings, get some of this blue sky in, and they got a nice reflection pool on the other side. So we're gonna see what we can get. The first shot I have in mind is something right through here. I'm not really keen on this. I guess that's a bike repair sort of stand. But right through here, we got some good shadows and we got some depth, especially back through that area right there. So I think I'm gonna shoot a vertical and go through there. Rangefinder's coupled with the front of the lens, but the viewfinder is just a standard on top viewfinder. So I'm not exactly sure how hard or how precise the compositions will be, but we're gonna see. All right, so let's meter this up and get a shot out of this. I've got Hector 100 in, and let's see, I want to shoot at f8. So 1/60th of a second at f8.5. All right, let's find my shutter speed here. Well, I don't have 1/60th of a second. I have 1/50th of a second. So it may be just a tad overexposed. That'll be okay. All right. Shutter is cocked. And we're good. All right. Good. All right. So I think I've got this set up. Hopefully it'll be a nice shot straight down through here. Got it metered up, so let's get a shot in there. All right, 1, 2, 3. That's good. Let's try to get a vertical out of this too. All right, let's go. 1, 2, 3. You know what? I didn't wind that last shot. Jeez. I got in a hurry. All right. So that is one shot I'll have to redo. Okay. Yep, got in a hurry. All right, let's see if I can get a horizontal out of it to correct what I just messed up. All right. Here we go, 1, 2, 3. All right, wind. Let's move on. So one thing that's actually tricky about this is you're not actually seeing through the lens. You're having to use this rudimentary viewfinder on the top. So, you know, I'm usually used to creating my compositions pretty tight within the boundaries of the frame. And this, I'm not exactly sure what the boundaries of the frame are. So I'm trying to get past the notion of getting it perfect in the viewfinder. I'm gonna shoot a little wider than I think I need to. So if I need to crop in, I'll be able to, because if I shoot too close, I can't do anything because all of that info is gone. So shooting a little bit wider and cropping in is what I wanna do. All right, so got another vertical out here. Let's look for a highlight. Okay, F22 on the masonry there. Save that. That's where some shadow area is, right over here. 5.6. And we're looking at 1/60th of a second at F11. Let's do that. Or 1/50th of a second at F11. a little bit of an overexposure won't hurt anything. Hey, I have wound the film to the next frame. Cock the shutter. Oh, before we do that, let's make sure we are focused. All right, I think I am. Cock the shutter. There we go. All right, let's wind on. Right, so I am out here in the tall grass, but I've got a nice little scene here. There's a log cabin with an old tractor in front. I mean, of course that looks picturesque, right? All right, so the handheld meter, if I just, like I should really go to my subject and put that there, but I'm gonna put it in the same light. So we're really influenced by this sun coming in from the side. So I'm gonna shade that. And in the shadows, I get 1/60th of a second at f8. And that was just about what I was looking at right over here. We got 5.6. I'm gonna err on the side of overexposure and go with 5.6, 1/60th at 5.6, or like I said earlier, 1/30th at f8. Let's get this thing focused up. (1/30th) at f8. Well, I've got 1/25th of a second. All right, gonna wind on. So if I don't do it now, I will absolutely double expose that. I'm on 7. Let's see if there's another shot around here before I pack it in for this location. Same sort of shot, I'm just getting the backside of the tractor in this time. Same exposure, I just need to refocus. And I want to focus on the rear wheels of the tractor. All right, same exposure as before though. All right, and 1, 2, 3. Good deal. So we have Frost Chapel behind us. We got some short lighting coming in because we've got the shadow side over here. Sun's coming in on that side. And for these first few shots, I'm gonna get the whole building and probably this big tree here on the side. So I've got it lined up here. I think I have one more exposure, so that'll be 8 total. And I screwed up one of those by double exposing it. Let's hope that that one turns out really artistic and I'll be able to do something with it. All right, so I'm gonna get metered up. Here it says f11 at 1/60th of a second. But if I shade the dome, f5.6 and a half at 60th of a second. All right, I'm gonna shoot f8 at 1/60th of a second. All right, let's pop out the focusing, the rangefinder piece. Well, I don't have 1/60th of a second, I have 1/50th of a second. But as we said before, a little overexposure probably won't hurt anything on this. All right. And that is all of this roll of film. So, since this is the first roll of film I have put through this, what have I learned? What I have learned is that once you make a shot on this camera, in this case, it really does make sense to go ahead and wind the film onto the next shot because there's no multi-exposure prevention. And if you move to a different location, set the thing up, focus, and forget that you haven't wound it, you're gonna double expose a shot. So we had one negative down like that already today. All right, so now I am going to change to some black and white film. I've got some T-Max 100, and we're gonna get closer. It was suggested to me, considering specifically about this camera, that when using it, the lens is sort of low contrast because it's not coated. And they said you might want to use a yellow filter. Well, it just so happens that this camera came with its own yellow filter. Specifically for this. So I'm wondering about giving that a shot. Depends on how clean I can get it. It also came with a red filter, or an orange filter, and a green filter. Well, that looks pretty good. Before I put that on there, let's see what sort of filter density I'm looking at. All right, let's clear all that. It's about a stop, maybe 3/4 of a stop. I'll err on the side of overexposure though, and we'll take that into consideration. We've got the yellow filter attached. All right, let's go find our first black and white shot. All right, so behind me, got this nice archway and this door, it's in the shade, which is good. So I'm not shooting into any sky. So hopefully I can frame this up fairly symmetrical. Again, it's going to be tough to do perfectly with this viewfinder, but we'll do our best. I do not want any flare in this, so I'm going to get a little closer, make sure I'm out of the flare. All right, so for this, we're going to have some different exposures for sure. I'm going to have some longer shutter speeds. Let's shoot for around f5.6. And I'm going to pull a highlight reading off of this. And then I'm going to pull a shadow reading off of this area right here. And that's giving me 2.8, f2.8 at 1/60th of a second. Well, I want 5.6. So I am going to drop this down to 1/15th of a second at f5.6. But I've got to correct for the yellow filter. So that's going to give me another stop. So we're looking at 1/8 of a second at f5.6. So I have 1/5 of a second and 1/10 of a second. So I'm just going to set it somewhere in between. f5.6, right? All right, let's make sure we are focused before I cock that shutter. And here we go. All right, wind the film to the next shot. The side of the church that I really want to shoot, where we've got short light coming in with the shadow side, I'm shooting pretty close. I'm shooting into the sun more than I want. And I'm aware that this lens could be prone to flare being uncoated. So just want to avoid that. I don't want any surprises. So we've got this right now. So we've got some nice shadow area there, and we've got some highlight areas here. So let's put that spot meter to use and see what we can come up with. Let's do 1/30th of a second and see, and let's measure based on that. So that's f22 and 1/30th of a second. Let's save that as our highlight point. All right, some shadow area right here is 2.8 and a half. Let's save that. Averaging that, we are looking at 1/30th of a second at f8, or accounting for the yellow filter on there, we've got 1/15th of a second at f8. Everything seems to be at f8 today so far. That's fine. We'll go down to f32 though. Let's do one at f11. That gives us 1/15th of a second at f11, plus another stop for the filter is going to give us 1/8 1/8 of a second at f11. All right, let's make sure the film is wound to number 2. It is. All right, let's focus before we do anything else. All right, so now cock the shutter. All right, move on to number 3. All right, so we got this nice sunlit side of the chapel, and so I'm gonna take advantage of that. Get these windows, this architecture right there. And I think for this shot, I'm gonna use the handheld meter and just take an incident light reading. So I've got 1/60th of a second at f16. Can go 1/120th of a second at f11. Let's go 160 at f11 because I still have the yellow filter on. All right, so 160 at f11. Like I said, I don't have 60, I've got 50. Still at f11 there. All right, let's make sure we're lined up here. Focus. All right, we'll wind on. All right, so I didn't want to shoot this straight on like I did the others because that's starting to get boring to me. You know, let's mix it up some. Let's get some angles in here. So I'm going to shoot across this just for a little bit more interest. And since we are in direct sun, there's not a whole lot of tonal variation. I'm just going to use the handheld meter. So if I point it back toward camera, I've got 1/20th of a second at f8. If I point it straight toward the sun area, I've got 1/20th of a second at f11. So I'm going to go with 1/20th of a second at f8, and then I'm going to adjust another stop for the filter. So 1/60th of a second or 1/50th of a second at f8. All right, shut. Focus confirmed. All right, let's move on. So let's see what sort of close-up capability we have with this camera. All right, so this is as close as we're gonna get with this. That's all right. Let's frame this sucker up. We're gonna do the same exposure because the light has not changed. Good, wind on to frame number 6. Same exposure, light hasn't changed. All right. So we're starting to get some interesting light through here. There's some shaded areas and some highlight areas, and yeah, I think I'm probably gonna get some sky in this shot, but I really like the idea of coming through here with the shot. I am gonna need to spot meter this because there's a pretty good variety of tones. So I've got a shadow area here, and I've got a highlight area there. So at 1/60th of a second, I can get 5.6. Let's go 1/30th of a second for f8. Let's go 1/15th of a second for f11. Let's check all that one more time just to make sure. Check. Right, so we're going 1/15th of a second at f16. So I can go 1/15th of a second at f11 because I still have to compensate one stop for the yellow filter. Okay, make sure we're focused. Okay, cock the shutter. Wind on to the last shot. So what I've got this facade here. Still shooting into the sun a little bit. But I'm just going to shade the lens with my hand and hope that'll take care of that flare.
So there's a highlight. There's a shadow. 1/15th at f11. Let's go 1/15th at f8. Shutter is cocked. So let's go back, process this stuff, and see what we've got.
So I'm going to be honest. I actually processed the black and white film first and just wasn't wowed by the results. But I do really like the color results. So I'm going to withhold overall judgment until I can shoot with it some more. One thing to note is that I shot the entire roll of black and white film with the yellow filter, the original filter that went with this camera. Now, I wouldn't normally expect that to make a huge difference in contrast, especially in regard to lowering the contrast. So again, I just need to shoot with it a bit more to get more familiar with it. One thing I absolutely found difficult was composing using the pop-up viewfinder. I am so spoiled by SLRs that show me almost exactly what I'll be getting. And in my opinion, the method used on the Ikonta, though, only gives you a rough idea at best. And what I found is that you really need to shoot wider, back up from your subject to make sure you get the important parts in. Then you can crop it later to fit what you envisioned. But if you do it this way, you're not really making the most use out of that huge 6x9 negative. I mean, the attractive element of shooting 6x9 is that big negative. It's fully 2 times the area of the 645 negative. But with this camera, you'll really need to accept that you'll probably need to do some cropping to the final image to match that vision. I also found that the viewfinder field of view changed if I moved my head slightly left or right. So I really need to be aware of my eye position. On this shot of the chapel, I was certain that I had it lined up symmetrically left to right, but that's obviously not the case. And as with any camera that's not an SLR, the closer you are to the subject, the more this is going to be evident due to parallax error. But other than me struggling with the viewfinder to try and make exact compositions, I like the camera. It's really easy to load and unload. The lens is really sharp. And even though I doubt it was designed for color film in mind, because this was 1934 after all, I think it did really well with the Ektar 100. And it's probably helped that that film is on the contrasty side in the first place. Now, the sharpness of this lens, if we zoom in on this black and white shot where we have the windows and that detail, you can see just how sharp this lens really is. Also be aware that the shutter speeds are not the modern standardized form. The camera's mark speeds are 1 second, 1/2 second, 1/5 of a second, 1/10 of a second, 1/25th, 1/50th, 1/100th, and 1/250th of a second. And the light meters I have use modern speeds. So if your meter suggests a 1/8 of a second exposure, the closest mark speed here is 1/10 of a second, which is going to give you a slight underexposure. On the other hand, if your meter suggests a 1/125th of a second exposure, the closest mark speed is 1/100th of a second, which is going to give you a small amount of overexposure. However, it's absolutely possible to set the shutter ring in between the mark speeds if you like. So the more familiar you are with the camera, the more at home you're going to be with this, and it'll probably be just fine. One final thing to be aware of with this camera is that it's really easy to make a double exposure by accident, as I did on that shot with the reflecting pool in the background. I sort of like how that turned out, and I was lucky. Just be careful to wind the film when you need to. All in all, it's amazing to be able to take photos with a 90-year-old camera. It does take a little more concentration to keep everything straight while shooting it, but it's a good challenge and quite rewarding when you manage to capture a shot that you like. If you have one of these, I'd love to hear what your experience is. Have you had more success with color film than black and white? Be sure to let me know in the comments. I also want to give a shout out to Zacks Camera Repair in Providence, Rhode Island. There aren't that many places you can send one of these in to be repaired, but the Zeiss folders are one of Zacks' specialties. The shutter was stuck when I got this one, so I sent it in, and they also cleaned up the lens and calibrated the rangefinder system. So I will leave a link to them in the description. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode on the Zeiss-Ikon Super Ikonta. If so, please be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing. The next episode coming up will be on the Pentax 6x7, so you don't want to miss that, right? I'll see you then.